Good afternoon. If there are people still in the back, in the exhibition area, if you would please come forward. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the first Humanities Forum event of the spring, which also is the first Asian Studies event of the spring as well. My name is Constantine Vaporis, and I'm Director of the Asian Studies program at UMBC. See just a few new faces here. So let me tell you that our Asian Studies program is the only one in the state where students can receive a Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies while getting foreign language training in 4 different Asian languages: Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, and Korean. And before I go any further and forget, I would ask you, of course, to please turn off your cell phones. Thank you. Today, actually, I'm wearing two different metaphorical hats since Dr. Jessica Berman, the director of the Drescher Center, is not able to be with us. She's actually on a plane heading towards London as we speak. Drescher Center runs the Humanities Forum. So in her place, let me welcome you to today's lecture, which is being held in conjunction with the exhibition which you walked through, 36 contemporary paintings from Myanmar. In Dr. Berman's place, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the other events in the Humanities Forum series, either on the flyer, there's material on the chairs, there's more material in the back on the table as you come in. There's a sign-up sheet if you are new to UMBC and would like to receive mailings about future events, such as the next Humanities Forum event, which is on Thursday, February 23rd in the Performing Arts Building at 5:30, a screening and discussion of the film I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And no, I'm not going to sing today. I'm told this is a spellbinding documentary about James Baldwin by UMBC faculty member Melida Benigne, if I didn't mangle that too badly, and Maurice Wallace, a professor from the University of Virginia. And they will lead a discussion on the film's importance and Baldwin's continuing significance today. So wearing now my other hat, the Asian Studies one, I'd like to draw your attention to our next event, a film screening and discussion by Dr. Harjot Gill, a professor of anthropology and a filmmaker from Towson University. You should be familiar to at least some of you. This is his third in a trilogy on Wednesday, February 22nd, a film called Sent Away Boys, which asks a series of questions. What happens to families in the absence of sons? What happens to land in the absence of farmers? What happens to communities in the absence of men? This is shot on location in the Punjab in India to chronicle the gradual transformation of agrarian landscape and patriarchal traditions through ongoing transnational migration. Certainly a topic of relevance that needs no further elaboration. Again, this is Wednesday, February 22nd at 4 o'clock right here. Now a word about the exhibit that you walked through. All of this began roughly a year ago now with an email that I received on the H-Asia network listserv talking about this collection of paintings and asking which universities might like to have it. I immediately answered the email, very unusual, and it's a good thing that I did because I just learned this morning that the exhibition is booked through the beginning of 2019. So I'm very thankful to the owner of these paintings, Vice President and Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Hong Kong, Ian Holliday, who is himself a scholar of Myanmar. When I took the idea for this exhibit to Tom Beck, the chief curator of the Library Gallery, and to Emily Haver, the curator of exhibitions, they were both as excited as I was. So I'd like to express my appreciation to both of them, but particularly to Emily, who did everything from A to Z to make the gallery look as amazing as it does. Would you please join me in thanking her? We burned a lot of midnight oil to get everything looking spectacular. Thank you so much. Now more than ever, the arts are important to us, and the support for them is critical. This exhibition today wouldn't have happened without financial support from a number of organizations, such as the Maryland State Arts Council, the Friends of the Library and Gallery, the Libby Kuhn Endowment, individual contributions, and of course the Asian Studies program. Today's lecture and the reception that follows it are co-sponsored as well by numerous organizations who were very anxious to join in. The Humanities Forum, Social Sciences Forum, Global Studies Program, Visual Arts Program, and I hope I didn't leave anybody out. There were more who wanted to volunteer. All of these programs have really been critical to the Asian Studies program, not just for this event, but during the past 6 years, and so thanks to all of them. And last but not least, a shout out, of course, to Tom Moore and Max Cole of the Office of Institutional Advancement for the excellent job that they did in advertising this event. How many of you heard announcements on WIPR? Some of you. Our Baltimore Sun had we made the week's 10 best list for the Baltimore Sun. Not quite sure what to make of the fact that we came in after Groundhog Day, film showing at the Senator at number 6. We made the top 10 and we're not last. So we'll take all the publicity we can get. So finally, to today's main event. Having made arrangements for the exhibit, I made inquiries about whom we might invite to speak about Myanmar to help us to understand the great changes that the country is undergoing and to give us some perspectives on the beautiful art that you see around you. Those inquiries led to one person, Dr. Christina Fink. So we're very appreciative that she's here with us today. Dr. Fink is professor of the practice of international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. She's a cultural anthropologist by training, one who has combined teaching, research, and development work throughout her career. She received her BA in International Relations from Stanford, and then the Master's and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Areas of expertise are, of course, Burma, Myanmar in particular, and Southeast Asia more generally, equitable development, gender and development, and civil society in ethnically diverse states. We are even more in need of her expertise given the sad news of the assassination of Kuhn just a few days ago, an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi. She is the author of Living Silence in Burma, Surviving Under Military Rule in 2009, and many journal articles and book chapters. Importantly, she's taught at the Elliott School for International Affairs at GW since 2011. From 2001 to 2010, she was a lecturer and program associate at the International Sustainable Development Studies Institute in Thailand. She has also acted as a consultant for many international programs, including the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., Canadian International Development Agency, the International Women's Development Agency, the Women's League of Burma, among others. She has lectured widely to a variety of governmental and university audiences, including the U.S. State Department, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as to congressional staff members, USAID, and so on. I'm sure that many of you will have questions for her about this very important work that she has done and continues to do, and you'll get the opportunity to do so in the Q&A session after the lecture, and then in the reception that will immediately follow after that. So I hope you will stick around for the entire event. And so without further ado, I'd like to present to you, Dr. Christina Fink.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, and I just have to say I'm just overwhelmed at how beautiful the exhibition is, and I want to thank the curators for doing an amazing job of setting this up, and also thank Professor Vaporis for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So I wanted to also introduce you to Professor Holliday, who Professor Vaporis mentioned, but he is a good friend, and as Professor Vaporis said, he's a scholar of Myanmar, but also is the person who collected this art and many, many more paintings with the idea of trying to capture this moment in time during Myanmar in transition, when artists are finally able to express themselves fully or pull out those paintings that have been in hiding at home and show them, because the censorship had been so strict before that they weren't able to until after 2011. So it's really exciting to see this show. So to start, I wanted to ask you to comment on this particular painting, which is when you come into the show, you'll see it on your right. So just throw anything out. What comes to mind when you look at this particular painting? Yeah?
Sort of, I'd say from a first glance, Impressionism meets Buddhist iconography.
Okay. Impressionism meets Buddhist iconography. I like that. Anything else? Don't feel shy. Just any reaction. Come on. Yes.
Strong shape of the harp.
Yes.
Right there.
Strong shape of the harp. So that's a Burmese harp, and something that Burmese people are very proud of. And actually, I will tell you something funny about that, which is that sometimes people are given Burmese harps by diplomats, but they're given very big ones, and it's a kind of passive-aggressive gift because it's very difficult to carry home, but it's a symbol of the country. Yeah?
I was looking and I finally disseminated what that was at the bottom of the picture. It's like an alligator with a person standing on it, and maybe like the person in the tiger are feeding that alligator.
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah. So we've got a crocodile down below and a tiger up above. And yeah, we don't know what's going on there, but maybe something violent, right? Great. So I just wanted to share with you 3 of my own interpretations. So I don't know what the artist had in mind, but the artist is Aung San, and he was a painter who started painting in the 60s, but Myanmar was under military rule from 1962 to 2011, and he was not able to do a solo show of his paintings because he was painting abstract work and nudes, and these were things that were not allowed under the military regime. So when you had a show, you would have to have the censors come first, and they would look at all the paintings, they would look at the descriptions of the painting, the title of the show. If they didn't like anything, they would either remove certain things or they would say that the entire show could not be open to the public. So he really suffered from that and wasn't able to do his own solo show until 2013. And this painting was painted in 2014, so recently, since the transition had begun. But I wanted to bring 3 interpretations to this painting. So the first is that this is a representation of Burmese traditional culture. So we have the harp, and we also have this figure here, which represents a knot, which is a spirit. Not is spelled N-A-T, but a Burmese spirit. So in Myanmar culture, you have 37 spirits who are kind of like the Greek gods and goddesses. Each has their own story. People know the stories of these spirits, and they are worshipped or propitiated often together with Buddha images in the temple, but in a slightly different location, and in other places. And this particular knot was a trader of tea. So in Myanmar, people not only drink tea, but they use fermented tea leaves to make an amazingly delicious salad. It's a unique food from Myanmar, and if you ever go there, you go to a Myanmar restaurant, you should definitely have it. So he was a tea trader in the 1400s, and he died on his journey by being bitten by a tiger. And he became one of these knots that is still remembered until today. So it's a representation of traditional culture, of things that are unique to Myanmar. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation that I'd like to give is that the nuts are also sometimes equated with people in power, because they can influence your life in a negative way if you don't pay respect to them. And so people also feel that way about people in power, that if you're not respectful to them and they're angry at you, then bad things can come from that. So it could be that he's saying, you know, this is his experience of life in Burma under military rule, of having to deal with these beings who are kind of unpredictable and threatening. And my third interpretation is that this is actually an ordinary Burmese citizen and living through this period of transition where there's both opportunity and uncertainty. And the uncertainty is represented by the tiger and maybe by the crocodile, that things have opened up, but many things haven't changed yet, and the future is unclear. And so I think that also really characterizes this particular show and the environment we're in Myanmar today. So I wanted to give you a brief introduction to the context and political history of the country, and then talk about the political transition. I want to spend some time on freedom of expression and access to information, as that really relates to this particular show. And then also talk a little bit about three issues that have been key to Myanmar since independence in 1948: the economy, civil war and managing pluralism in the country, and social development. So 3 key points that I want to emphasize. The first is that the political transition started in 2011, but it is not by any means finished. This is still a very uncertain period, and it's possible that things could reverse, or that this is going to be a kind of up and down trajectory. The second point is that the military continues to play a very significant role in the politics of the country. They still have a lot of power, and we'll discuss that in more detail. And they often have different perspectives on how the country should be governed, how the country's problems should be resolved, than the civilian parts of the government and society as a whole. And then the third is that as much as people want change, the legacies from the past still have a real hold on the way that things operate in the country. So change in many ways hasn't been as fast as people want it. And in some ways, there are things that people want to hold on to from the past that are both positive and negative. So since independence, the balance of power between the military and civilians has been a significant concern. And civil war has characterized much of the country since independence as well. So you have civil war between ethnic armed groups who are fighting against the military or the government, and you also have communal conflict, particularly between Muslims in Western Myanmar and the Buddhist community, and it has also erupted in different parts of the country at different times. And Myanmar is a very rich country in terms of natural resources, and at the time of independence, people expected that it was going to be one of the most prosperous and thriving countries in Southeast Asia. But that vision has not been realized until today. So there's this question of how can we make life better for the people, and why isn't life better for the people given the fact that the country has a wealth of natural resources? So Burma or Myanmar, what should we call it? This is a challenge that our government, the US government, is continuing to wrestle with because the military government renamed the country Myanmar in English in 1989, which was a time of turmoil in the country. And they wanted to say that this was a fresh start, and they wanted to reject the colonial baggage of the past. So they said that Burma was a colonial term, Myanmar was the nationalistic term for the country. In Burmese, actually, both terms are used more or less interchangeably, but to kind of separate themselves from the past, they said that in English they would like to have Myanmar used, not Burma anymore. But the democracy movement at the time said, we don't accept that. actually, we don't have a problem in Burma or Myanmar, but we don't accept that the military regime is going to change the name unilaterally without asking us, without consulting us, and really with the objective of trying to whitewash the fact that they are still in power. So until today, many people in the democracy movement continue to use the name Burma. And that includes Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the de facto leader of the country right now. And so our government is in the difficult position of whether to use Burma or Myanmar. And so in official communications, usually they use Burma, but unofficially they use Myanmar. And so I will use both terms. Burma or Myanmar is in Southeast Asia. I'm sure you know that. But the feeling for people in Burma and Myanmar is that they are, in the words of the first prime minister, a tender gourd surrounded by prickly cactuses. So they feel that, you know, China above, India, even though India is over here, there's this piece of India that is right on the border with Myanmar, are kind of surrounding them and could overtake them at any time. And so there is this feeling of kind of existential crisis that is easy for politicians to activate in the country. The borders of the country were drawn by the British. The British colonized the country in the 1800s, and the borders mostly run along mountain ridges and rivers, and they actually divide a lot of peoples between different countries. So you have populations that live on both sides of the border between Myanmar and Thailand, Myanmar and China, Myanmar and India, Myanmar and Bangladesh. And you have a wide range of ethnic groups in the country. The exact number is also an issue of contention in the country, but let's just say that there are dozens of different ethnic groups in the country. So pre-colonial period, what people are most proud of in the country today is the fact that there were these huge kingdoms that expanded into parts of what are now Thailand, northeastern India, and that these were Buddhist kingdoms. And so during the times of those kingdoms, people would make merit and also show off their wealth by building temples. And so Bagan, one of the largest capitals from the past, has over 4,000 Buddhist structures. And most of them are still standing, although not necessarily in good shape. And this is something that people are still very proud of today. So during British colonial rule, the king was removed, and he and his family were sent to India and spent the rest of their life in India. And also the head of the Buddhist faith was kind of decentered from the position that he had had as advisor to the king and also overseer of all the Buddhist monks in the country. And so people felt like, you know, their center, their power center, their religious center was completely removed by British rule. And at the same time, a lot of foreign influences came into the country. So one was Christian missionaries, and among the minorities in particular, there were people who converted to Christianity. And there were also many immigrants from South Asia, because Burma was part of the British Raj. It was ruled as part of India, and also from China. Immigrants from China were also welcomed into the country during that period. And so for Burmese people, they felt like this wasn't our choice, and these people are coming in and they're assuming positions of power, wealth, and influence over us. And there was a lot of resentment about that, and that continues to influence relations between the different communities today. So during the British colonial period of colonial rule, of course, there was also a resistance movement that developed. And one of the people who was very active in that movement was Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San. And he became active as a university student at Rangoon University, along with other university students. And then he connected with people outside the country. He felt like nonviolent struggle was not going to unseat the British, and so an armed struggle was going to be the only way to fight them. And he and 29 of his colleagues made their way to Japan, where they got military training. And when Japan invaded Burma in 1941, General Aung San and his troops came with the Japanese from Thailand and moved back into Burma from there. So during World War II, the British actually had to retreat from Burma, and the Burmese nationalists, together with the Japanese, were in charge of the country. But the nationalists soon soured on the Japanese because they had felt that the Japanese were going to be their liberators, but in reality, the Japanese seemed to act not very different from the way the British had acted. And so ultimately, the nationalists changed sides and secretly joined with the Allies in the last few months of the war and tried to undermine Japanese rule in the country. After the war, the British returned to Burma and wanted to continue to rule the country, but the nationalist movement was strong enough to say, you know, no, we're not going to put up with that. And so the British said that, all right, we will grant you independence if you can work out some arrangement with the ethnic minority leaders in the country, because the British had ruled the country kind of in two separate ways. So in the center of the country, they ruled directly. In the mountains that were around the plains, they ruled through the local rulers, indirect rule. So the British said, okay, Aung San, if you can go and talk to those leaders and convince them to become part of a union of Burma, you can have independence. And so he was able to do that, and the British agreed that Burma would become independent in January 1948. So General Aung San set up a cabinet, and they had a kind of pre-independence cabinet that was already preparing for the transfer of power. But tragically, a rival politician sent some gunmen into the cabinet meeting and assassinated General Aung San and most of the cabinet 6 months before independence. And this was just such a huge loss. He was just such an amazing man because of the way that he could relate to people all over the country. And while not every ethnic leader felt that they could trust him, he was able to win the trust of so many people. And he was somebody who could really bring people together. By the way, this painting is in Ian Holliday's collection, which you can see online, although it's not here. So anyway, the country became independent, and the first prime minister was U Nu, and he had this grand vision for the country to be prosperous and every family to have land and a beautiful home and a car, and it was all going to be wonderful. But unfortunately, civil war broke out right after independence, and you had forces all over the country who were trying to either rule in their own areas or take over the capital. There were a lot of guns that were remaining from World War II, and the government and the military itself were very weak. And so there was a feeling that armed struggle was the way you could get what you wanted. And so there were communist groups, there were ethnic armed groups who had an ethnic autonomy agenda, and the country really was just submerged in civil war for the first 4 years. After that, at least, you know, the armed groups were pushed out of the center of the country, but the civil war continued in the mountainous areas until today. Another challenge for U Nu was the fact that his party split into two groups, and they were fighting each other. And so the military took advantage of this in 1958 to step in and create a caretaker government for 18 months. After that, they did hand power back to civilian government. They held elections. U Nu won again. And when he won the election, one thing that his party did to try to garner votes, because his party had split into two, so he was head of one faction, was he promised that he would make Buddhism the state religion. And so after he was reelected in 1960, the parliament voted and Buddhism was made the state religion. And while he assured the minorities who were Christian, Muslim, Hindu, that they would be protected as well, many of them were worried about what was going to happen to them in the future. So the military took over in 1962. They'd had a taste of power from 1958 to 1960. And as some of the ethnic political leaders were talking about wanting to renegotiate for more power in their states, the military said, we can't let this happen. And they took power. The reason they gave was that if UNU kept ruling, these minority leaders were going to negotiate with the government and the country was going to fall apart. There was going to be secession of all these different ethnic states and there would be no more Union of Burma. The other reason they gave was that the politicians were too self-interested. They didn't care about the good of the country as a whole. Only the military really represented and stood for the country as a whole. And so with that, military rule began. And at the time, people thought that it wouldn't last very long. They thought it would be short, just like it had been from 1958 to 1960. But unfortunately, things worked out differently. And once the military was rooted, it was very difficult for people to try to dislodge them. So what they did this time was to immediately end independent media. There were only state media publications. They also prevented any independent kind of activist civil society organizations from operating anymore. They were either turned into state organizations or they had to disband. They also didn't allow any criticism of the government. That would land you in jail. Businesses were nationalized and they cut off the country from the rest of the world. They really closed in and became a kind of hermit kingdom like North Korea has been. And in 1987, the country actually asked the UN to give them least developed country status because they were in such dire economic straits, they couldn't pay back their loans to the World Bank and the IMF. And so they wanted to negotiate better terms for those loans. And the UN granted them least developed country status. And this was announced in the state media. And people in the country were just shocked because, as I said in the beginning, the country is rich in natural resources. How could it end up a least developed country? So this was one of the factors that led to the 1988 uprising, the pro-democracy uprising. People were so angry that the government had run them into the ground. Basically, it had been a socialist economic, the government used socialist economic principles, but poorly. And so people did not have enough food. People had to sell their rice to the government. Even if they didn't produce the quota, what they would have to do is go buy rice in the market and add that to their rice to give to the government at the lower state price for rice to meet their quota, because if they didn't meet their quota, they would go to jail. So it was a really difficult time. And in 1988, students who were frustrated with military rule took an incident where some students and some local police officer, there was a brawl between some local people and students, and the police reacted harshly and punished the students, and this led to this major blow-up in the capital at the time, Rangoon, and then spread from there around the country to 6 weeks of protests against military rule, and people were calling for the restoration of democracy. But after 6 weeks, the military reasserted control and said, all right, we're going to give you multi-party elections in 1990, but there's going to be no more protesting from now on. During the time of the uprising, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people were killed, including many young people, not only university students, even children. So it was a tragic time, and this painting kind of captures that kind of devastation and sadness. And then to the right is a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi. So she was General Aung San's daughter. She had been abroad. She came back in 1988 when her mother was sick and happened to be in the country when the uprising broke out. And so people came to her and said, you've got to go speak. You've got to go speak to all the people because you're General Aung San's daughter. You're our independence hero's daughter. And so she gave a speech which 500,000 people apparently showed up for and said, you know, don't be angry at the military, but yes, we have to have democracy. And so she established a party that ran in the 1990 elections. It was called the National League for Democracy. And this party quickly had a national presence, and the military had expected that they could have their own party win the election because a whole lot of parties were forming, and they thought our party can get a plurality, even if we can't get a majority, and all the other parties will split the vote. But it clearly wasn't going to turn out that way because her party was able to galvanize people all over the country behind her. And so the military put her under house arrest. They put the leading people in her party in prison. And they thought, okay, now we've taken care of the NLD. Now we'll definitely win the election. But it didn't turn out that way. The NLD won a landslide victory. The military didn't know what to do. They did not want to transfer power to the NLD, so they just annulled the results of the election and didn't transfer power. And they continued ruling from 1988 until 2011. So one thing they did do was they realized we've got to change our economic policies. So they opened up to foreign investment. They opened up a bit more also to tourism. And they really wanted to get a lot of investment into the country because they felt like, we don't really know how to run the economy, but if foreign investors can come in and run businesses here, then that's going to make a big difference for us. But the problem was that they continued to be extremely repressive in the way that they dealt with nonviolent dissenters, people in the Civil War areas. The ordinary people who were living in those areas were treated terribly, not just the ethnic armed groups that they were fighting against. And so Western countries imposed sanctions on Myanmar. And the United States, for instance, imposed an investment ban and also an import ban on products from Myanmar. So even though there were other countries around the world, for instance in Asia, that did not have investment bans, this affected IMF and World Bank lending to the country, and it also just made business people more cautious about wanting to invest in Myanmar. And so while there was some investment, it was not to the extent that the government would have liked. In 2003, the government said, okay, we really are going to hand over power to a democratically elected government. We've got a roadmap to democracy, and we're going to follow our roadmap, and then we will have democracy. But they didn't say when that was going to be. And in 2005, they moved the capital from the main city, Rangoon or Yangon, to the middle of the country. And they built this grandiose new capital up there. And so people thought, they're never going to transfer power. It just seemed so unlikely, and it was such a depressing time. But in 2008, they did complete writing a new constitution, and they said that we are going to go ahead and hold elections in 2010. And these are just a couple of pictures from the new capital. This is the parade ground for the military, and you can see the statues of 3 of Burma's imperialist kings from the pre-colonial period. So this seemed to be the military leadership equating itself with these warrior kings from the past. These are enormous statues. And again, sent really a signal to people that the military was not ready to step down. So during this period, as I said, there was foreign investment, but there were also sanctions, human rights abuses, and a lot of political prisoners. So one of the political prisoners was Thein Sein, and this is one of his paintings that's also in Ian Holliday's collection, but it's not here. So while he was in prison, he began painting using the garments of other prisoners. And he was able to pay off the guards to smuggle in his paints and other supplies so that he could paint in prison, and then pay off the guards to smuggle the pieces out. Although he couldn't show any of this work, of course, until after there was a transition to a more open government. Thein Sein is the name of the biggest prison outside of Yangon, and this is where many political prisoners have spent many years of their lives. So during this period of military rule, there were a lot of things that you couldn't paint. So one we already talked about was nudes, another abstract painting. The government didn't like that. They wanted realism, but also it had to be positive. So they didn't want any paintings of poverty. They didn't want foreigners to see that. They didn't want their own people to see that, even though people obviously saw poverty in their daily life. They didn't want people to be mobilized by seeing paintings of poverty. So this painting, for instance, wasn't possible, could not be shown until after the transition. And likewise, the painting on the left, which is representing political prisoners, and the color red, which represents revolution. So any paintings which had a lot of red were immediately banned because they signaled revolution. So in 2011, there was a partial transfer of power. This followed the 2010 elections. So Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest in 2010. She'd been let out a couple of times, but she was always put back in. And her party did not run in the election because she was still under house arrest and many party members were still in prison. So the government, or the military, had set up their own military-backed party, and there were a few other parties, but the military party easily swept the election because of a lack of competition and also intimidation. People were told, if you want to get the benefits of development, you better vote for our party or you're not going to get those benefits. So people, in many cases, felt that it was in their interest to vote for the military-backed party. The military constitution reserved a lot of power for the military. So what you had was these people who'd been in uniform, who were now elected, they took off their uniforms and it was the same people ruling the country. So old wine in new bottles, right? But at the same time, you had active duty military holding 3 of the key cabinet positions, 25% of the seats in parliament, which you can see here. You can see this grandiose, beautiful parliament building. And they also were able, or are able, to veto any changes to the Constitution. So one of the main things that Aung San Suu Kyi and the democracy movement have been fighting for in this current era is to change the Constitution to reduce the military's power in politics. But they can't do that unless the military agrees to it, because you can't change the Constitution unless more than 75% of the representatives vote for that. But 25% of the seats are held by the military. So it's a challenging environment. And so as Burma went into 2011 with this new government, people didn't feel very hopeful. They felt like this was all just a game because it was still the military in power. But in fact, the new president, President Thein Sein, who you can see here next to Aung San Suu Kyi, made some really dramatic moves that opened up the country in a number of unexpected ways. And I think that he will be remembered very positively in the future. So one of the things he did was, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest soon after the election, but he met with her in 2011, and then he encouraged her to run in the by-elections, which were held in 2012. A number of the people who were elected to parliament then went on to cabinet positions and other positions, and so by-elections were held to fill those seats in parliament. And she did, in fact, run in 2012 along with other members of her party. So 40 members of her party were in the parliament starting in mid-2012. The other thing is, he promised repeatedly that he was going to work for people-centered development, which was a big deal because previously development really only seemed to be for the military itself. This whole building of a new capital, which cost millions and millions of dollars, was of no benefit to ordinary people in the country. But he actually started following through on investing in things that would make a difference in people's lives, like health, education, local roads, electricity, water, etc. So under President Thein Sein also, space started opening up for people to be able to express themselves. And this happened in film as well as in paintings. So films were also censored in the past. And in 2012, there was a film festival in which the winning film was about the censorship of films in the past. And it was called Ban That Scene. And you can watch this on YouTube if you want, and it's all subtitled in English. But what it's saying here is, sure, you know, we're happy to censor your movie. You just need to pay for it. You got to pay for the film. You've got to pay for our service of censoring you. You've got to pay for your censorship card. And this is all going to cost you about $100, which in the old days in Myanmar was a lot of money. So people not only had to get censored, but they had to pay for their censorship. And they had to pay bribes to let certain things slide, often in the past. Okay, also a really interesting Burmese tradition was allowed to come back, and that is performing satirical chants at the Burmese New Year, which takes place in April. And so this was a time of year, it was a kind of, if you've studied anthropology, it's a ritual of reversal. So it's a time when you can criticize the government, even though normally you can't. And so people every year in the past would draft these satirical verses, and then it's a call and response kind of form, and chant them. And much of these verses would be critical of the government. So, of course, the military regime banned these, but they were still performed in exile. So here you can see a group of Burmese in California who were performing this at a festival, I think in 2014. But in Yangon in 2013, they were allowed again to perform these chants. And another thing that was revived is a cartoon festival in Yangon. So there was a famous cartoonist, U Bajan, who died in the 1950s. And he lived on 13th Street. And actually, the street is also named after him, Bajan Street. And so every year, the current cartoons would be hung on this street. And there would be a street festival. But this, too, was banned under the military regime and just allowed to restart under the Thein Sein government. Also, communication has improved. So under the military regime, cell phones, or the SIM cards in cell phones, cost over $1,000. This is like 10 years ago, $1,000. I mean, people here can't afford $1,000 for a cell phone. You can imagine in Myanmar. And the idea was to really restrict people's access, because being able to communicate meant being able to organize. And the government didn't want that. So the supply of SIM cards was strictly controlled, and very few people had them. But after 2011, President Thein Sein said, I realize we need to improve communications in the country. He invited a bunch of companies to come in, and now cell phones and those SIM cards just cost a few dollars, and something like 70% or maybe 80% of the population has a cell phone. That happened within 3 years. It was just unbelievable. And so this is a survey done by one of the cell phone companies about what people are using cell phones for, and I think it's really interesting that most people get internet through their cell phones, because most people don't have computers. So cell phones are not only for talking to each other, but also for accessing the internet. And Facebook is the major form of communication in Myanmar. And even for news, most people get their news on Facebook. Also, private newspapers were allowed to publish freely. So previously, they could only issue weekly editions. They were pre-censored before they could be released. But now they're not pre-censored, and they can issue daily editions. And so there's been a real expansion of the news industry. In 2015, there was the second election since the transformation. And Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, won the election. So this was an amazing moment in the country. People felt like, you know, their votes from 1990 were finally being counted 25 years later. It was just astounding. But Aung San Suu Kyi was not allowed to become the president of the country, because there was a clause in the Constitution that prevented that. Anyone who has a foreign spouse, foreign children, cannot be the president of the country. So she was married to a British academic who had died, but her 2 children have British citizenship. So she couldn't become the president. And so instead, the NLD came up with the idea to create this position called state counselor, which basically is like prime minister. And she became the state counselor, but it means the de facto ruler of the country. And this is her with the president, who is a loyal colleague, who's really a kind of placeholder for her. And then down below, her with the military. Of course, the military was not happy with that move. They didn't say anything at the time, but they were not happy with that. And so what's really characterized this period since she's been in power is she and the military trying to figure out where they can work together and how they can further their interests, which often are in contradiction with each other. And I think that we don't know who's behind the killing of U Ko-ni, the constitutional law expert who advised Aung San Suu Kyi, but there's suspicion that somebody connected to the military or somebody who supports continued military influence and involvement at a high level in politics was behind this assassination. So he was assassinated this past weekend, and the person who shot him has been caught, but he's just a hired gun. So now the question is, who was actually behind that? Successes during the NLD period of government have been the removal of sanctions by all countries on Myanmar, but the strictest sanctions were from the United States, and those sanctions have been lifted, except for the arms embargo. So one thing that people expected when Aung San Suu Kyi came to power was that censorship would be over, and freedom of expression, freedom of information would be guaranteed 100%. I mean, isn't that what the NLD had been fighting for? They were the democracy movement. And in fact, that hasn't been the case. So this comes back to the point that sometimes things that have been in place for a long time are hard to change. And so defamation cases have been brought against people who've criticized the military, by the military, and also the NLD has brought defamation cases against people who've criticized their government. There's still a state media newspaper, actually there are a couple of them, that are being published. People thought that once the NLD came to power, this propaganda mechanism would be removed. Maybe there'd be something like, we have here like PBS, but that hasn't been the case. Aung San Suu Kyi has continued to run the Global New Light of Myanmar, and you can see the front page news here is State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi receives special advisor to Japanese PM. Not really scintillating, breaking news, and this is the day after the assassination of U Ko-ni, so very strange. Also, the military has blocked media access to conflict areas, and it's difficult still to say anything critical of the military, whether it's in the press or elsewhere. Now I want to turn briefly to development, because there are a couple of different perspectives on how development should be pursued in the country. One is exploit the natural resources, because this is easy and we've got a lot of them. And so this is what you can see in the jade mines of northern Myanmar. And Myanmar is making as much as $30 billion a year in the sale of jade. Not all of that is going directly to the government, but much of that money is not going into the state coffers. It's going into different accounts, and nobody knows what's happening to it. Another type of development has been hydropower, so building big dams and selling the electricity to China and other neighboring countries. And so one dam that's planned here is the Myitsone Dam, and President Thein Sein suspended construction of the dam. Aung San Suu Kyi hasn't said for sure either way whether the dam will go ahead or not. But local communities are protesting because already 15,000 people have been displaced to make way for the dam, and it's supposed to flood an area the size of Singapore. And reportedly, over 90% of the electricity would actually go to China, not to Myanmar. And another project is a copper mine that has also resulted in displacement and environmental damage, again, run by China together with a military company, and leading to many protests. So one way to deal with this is for civil society and the government to work together to try to get all of these investments that are happening through state-owned companies, military-owned companies, on the books, recorded and transparent, and then making sure that the money from the profits from those investments are actually being used for the good of the country as a whole. So civil society has been working hard on that, but it's been an uphill battle. 70% of the people in Myanmar are agriculturalists. So another issue has been, should we support smallholder farmers or should we do industrial agriculture, large plantations, industrial farming? And you know, you can imagine that people are on different sides on that. Many of the paintings in Myanmar are about, you know, show these beautiful ox carts, and it is so picturesque as a tourist to go to the country and see the ox carts, and people are still using the ox carts for transportation and in their fields. But if you're a farmer, you'd really rather have mechanical equipment, but most farmers cannot afford that. One of the ways that the government has tried to enable industrial agriculture is through land confiscation. So this happened under military rule, but it's continuing today. So massive amounts of land around the country have been confiscated and then leased to foreign investors and domestic companies to create plantations. And so farmers who are saying, wait, this is our land, have been protesting and sometimes reoccupying their land, and that has landed them in prison. Another continuing problem is the civil war. So this is in the ethnic areas in the mountains surrounding the plains. Some groups have made ceasefires with the government. Other groups are continuing to fight. So we have peace talks here, but also over 100,000 displaced people in northern Myanmar where the fighting is continuing. And the impacts of the civil war on the populations are dramatic and terrible from a development perspective. So one thing is that many of the armed groups and the military itself rely on the profits from heroin, opium cultivation and the production of heroin to fund themselves, and this has led to widespread addiction. And then another problem is the widespread use of landmines and the number of people who have stepped on those landmines and, you know, will continue the rest of their lives if they survived either without a leg or often blinded or missing an arm. So the main issue with the Civil War is, should the country be under centralized rule or should there be a federal system, something like in the United States? For the military, it's very difficult for them to accept the idea of a federal system. But for the ethnic minority peoples, they feel that without a separation of power and autonomy in their areas, they don't want to be a part of Myanmar. So this is an issue that remains unresolved. And then the last part I wanted to talk about is really social development and social relations, social inclusion. So most of the people in Myanmar are Buddhist. About 90% of the population, 87% to 90% of the population is Buddhist. And the monks, you know, I think our image of monks is that they're peaceful, they're in the temple meditating, but in Myanmar there's a long history of activism among monks, both in the colonial period against military rule. Here in 2007, Saffron uprising against the military government, and today against the role of Muslims in Myanmar and even having Muslims be citizens in Myanmar. So this is showing a protest by monks against a population that lives in western Myanmar by the border with Bangladesh. So the position of many people in Myanmar is that this population is actually a foreign population and that they should not be granted citizenship in the country, even though many of them have lived in the country for generations. And the bottom picture is showing local people demanding that NGOs leave the country or leave that area because the NGOs were helping this displaced Muslim population. Education is another area where the issue of inclusion of minority languages, a history that really covers the experiences of everybody in the country. Should that happen, or should it continue to be a Burman-centric curriculum, both in terms of content and language? And the other issue in education is rote memorization versus student-centered learning, which teachers have tried to introduce in some places, but even parents are resistant to the idea because in order to get into university, you have to pass exams that are based on rote memorization, so they feel like this is useless. So people-centered development, what does that mean? Really, it means that people have to do development themselves in many cases. So do-it-yourself development is solar panels, which you see all over rural Myanmar. 84% of the people in rural areas are not connected to the electricity grid. But there is also government money for development, and that's included in many places access to water. So I think the figure is only 80% of the population have access to safe drinking water, and only 4% of households have actually piped water into their households. But also international development organizations are now able to work freely in the country. In most areas, they were not under military rule. And so this bridge, for instance, was built by a small international development organization in cooperation with local people. And this is an example of microfinance, which is being done by a bigger international development organization, PACT. So Aung San Suu Kyi went to Singapore just a couple of months ago, and what she said to the Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, was at the beginning of Singapore's independence, the Prime Minister at the time, Lee Kuan Yew, said that in 20 years, Singapore would be ahead of Burma. So that's at independence, right? 1948 or 1950s. Or would have caught up with Burma. But of course today, Singapore is far ahead of Burma if we think about the economic development of the country. So she said, I think we have to change that a bit and say, in 20 years' time, Myanmar will have overtaken Singapore. Now this seems unrealistic at the moment, but when we look around and see the art here and the vitality and potential, that kind of unleashed potential within the Myanmar population, I think we can have hope that at least Myanmar can begin that journey, and that ultimately people in Burma will be able to live with security, dignity, and opportunity in the years ahead. So thank you.
Take some
Yes,
questions.
so I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah.
As a result of the civil wars, how many people have left Burma and where did they go?
Right, so you have an exodus of two kinds of people from Burma. You had people, well, three kinds really, business people who left, who wanted to be able to do business because their businesses had been nationalized. And then you had democracy activists who left from the heartland. And then you have people who lived in the conflict areas who fled over the borders to neighboring countries. So Thailand has over 100,000 Burmese refugees today, but over the past 20 years, they've probably had, in the refugee camps alone, well over 300,000, but there are about 3 million Burmese workers in Thailand, many of whom have fled for a mix of economic and political reasons. Refugees have also gone to India, Bangladesh, to China, but in lesser numbers. China tends to accept people during the immediate fighting, but then they ask that they go back. But many people have ended up in the diaspora around the world as well. So in the United States, Australia, Canada, in Japan, all over the world. Yeah.
What is your prediction about the way Myanmar will go now with the lady in power after all these years and seemingly kind of fudging on some of these issues that she stood for, her ideals? What do you think?
I would like to be positive. It's challenging. I would say this. The Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD were in prison, basically, for 2 decades, more than 2 decades. And they don't have policy experience. They don't have the experience of implementing policy. And so this has been a big learning curve for them. but it's not quite 1 year yet, and they have 4 more years. Their terms are 5 years rather than 4 years. So it's my hope that they're going to grow into their role, and they're going to become more confident in policy making and also in addressing these issues of freedom of expression and also inclusion for all people in the country. Yeah.
Oh, so I know that China has been a big investor in Southeast Asian economies. So now that Myanmar has opened up to foreign investment, what's their relationship with China?
Yeah, that's been really interesting because before, when the Western countries really weren't engaging very much, particularly economically, with the government, China basically had free rein. And so they were able to pursue the hydropower dam projects, the copper mines, et cetera, really without any input from civil society or communities. And the government didn't impose any kinds of restrictions on them, like you have to do an environmental impact assessment, you have to do a social impact assessment, you have to contribute to communities that have to be relocated. None of that happened in the past, but now that there are other investors coming and people in Myanmar can speak out and protest, China has really changed the way that it's doing business in the country. And now they're saying in all future projects, we will do these kinds of impact assessments. We will provide support for communities that are affected by the work that we're doing. We want to engage with communities. So it's really changed the way that they are interacting with the government and also with the communities in a positive way. Now they have to compete with other companies, and that's been a good thing. Yeah.
To what extent has the per capita income of the people gone up since these outside investments and reforms?
Not very much. So it's interesting because if you look at the increase in GDP per year, the growth rate, it has been 7 to 8% for the last 3 or 4 years. So that's very impressive compared to here, for instance, right? But in fact, most of that money is not reaching ordinary people. It's not being made by ordinary people because most of that money is from resource extraction. It's natural gas, oil, jade, gems, lumber. It's extraction. And so that money is going into, we wish, completely into the government coffers, but a lot of it seems to be siphoned off into different directions, including, perhaps the military. We don't know if different individuals are also able to siphon it off personally. And so most ordinary people are just trying to get their land back so that they can actually farm on that land. I would say in the urban areas, however, there is a growing middle class, which is built around tourism. There's been a huge increase in tourism and foreign investors coming in, so the hotel industry and other businesses that are supportive of foreign investment and tourism in urban areas are doing well. So that's been a plus. Yeah.
Is the violence against women in Myanmar similar to the violence against women in different parts of India? And since Aung San Suu Kyi has gained power, do you think the violence against women in her country has flared up or been quelled?
Yeah, great question. So, there's violence against women, which is happening in the conflict areas. So there's been a lot of reporting by human rights organizations, both local human rights organizations and international human rights organizations, about the abuses that have been committed by the Myanmar army in the conflict areas. Because when they enter an area, they see the entire population in that area as their enemy, because they feel that these people are supporting the ethnic armed groups. They're joining the groups, they're providing intelligence to the groups, they're feeding the armed groups, so they're all the enemy. So therefore, the Myanmar army feels that they can do whatever they want to these populations. And violence against women, rape, has been something that's been documented over the last 20 years. And the military says that that's not happening, but like I said, the media is not able to get into these areas to validate that There are people who are coming out of these areas who are saying that it is still happening, and there are local human rights groups who are reporting on it continuing to happen. But it's, the military has been very aggressively refusing to deal with this issue. And one of the provisions in the Constitution is that anything that has to do with the military, any criminal case that has to do with the military, is tried by the military in a military court. They have allowed, in certain cases, some cases to come up in civil court in the last couple of years, but that's been very rare. Mostly what they'll do, if there's really evidence and enough people around, the military will pay off that family, but there won't be a court case. Then the other form of violence against women is just in the population as a whole, both domestic violence and violence by other people, strangers, whatever. And a lot of women's groups in the country are very concerned actually about the spread of internet access, because people who didn't have access to pornography before, or not easy access anyway, now have it at their fingertips. And according to women's groups, they see a connection between the availability of pornography and crimes against women, and also rape of children. But it may just be that now, because the media is more free, that the media is able to report on these crimes, and civil society organizations are more active. They're identifying people. People are coming forward and talking about what's happening to them in a way that they didn't before. So we don't know if it's increased or remained the same, but certainly it's an issue that's it's of great concern to many people in society, and Parliament is debating both a bill on violence against women and how to deal with that, and also on child rape right now. But Aung San Suu Kyi's position has been, this is an issue, but she hasn't taken it on as her main issue. Her main issue is really changing the Constitution to reduce the military's role in politics and bringing about peace in the country. Yeah.
Following that kind of, has the new Aung San Suu Kyi's government, has it seen any change in the relationship with ethnic minorities and the conflicts going on in these areas?
Yeah. So under President Thein Sein, he set up a big team that was negotiating with the different ethnic armed groups and trying to bring about a political settlement. In the past, the military governments had said, we'll make ceasefires with you guys, you are ethnic armed groups, but we can't make any political deals because we're just a transitional government. And so there were ceasefires where both sides weren't fighting each other, but there was no political talks at all until after 2011. So under President Thein Sein, the idea was to have a process where ceasefires were made and those were immediately followed by political talks. And they had gotten to the stage where the framework for how the political talks would proceed was about to happen at the very end of President Thein Sein's administration. Since Aung San Suu Kyi came to power, her team, she has a whole new team, and they've had to get up to speed on who are these groups, what do they want. There are multiple groups. There are more than 20 groups, we could say, ethnic armed groups who are involved in these discussions. And the military's agenda has been to kind of continue on the ground to try to take territory, reduce the space where the ethnic armed groups can operate. That makes the ethnic armed groups angry. They don't trust the government. They feel like the peace process is a joke. And so it's been very difficult to make progress. So things are kind of stalled at the moment. Yeah.
Would you mind sharing with us a little bit your own personal
All right,
experiences?
I said I was going to do that and I forgot. Okay, so I was based in Thailand working for the Open Society Institute, which is under the Soros Foundation, starting in 1995, 95, I think, 96. And so the Soros Foundation was supporting the nonviolent resistance movement, federalism, rule of law, those kinds of principles, and working with civil society groups inside and outside the country that were engaged in that kind of work. And so I was in and out of the country during that period, 1995, 1996, meeting with civil society groups, meeting with people in the opposition and others. But in 1997, I was banned from the country because some of the groups that we supported were involved in demonstrations in 1996, and they were arrested. And when they were interrogated, came out, they were doing things like distributing films that were critical of the government, and printing flyers, and photocopying surreptitiously like dissident poems. For that, they were sentenced to sentences from like 7 to 14 years in prison, or 21 years in prison. It was just terrible. But anyway, so during that time, I was banned from the country, and I wasn't allowed to go back until 2012. During that period, I also wrote a book about the country, which the military didn't like because it was about life under military rule. But during that period, I married a Burmese guy who was a democracy activist at the time. And in 2011, we moved back to the States, 2010. In 2012, things opened up. I got off the banned list. He also had been banned. He lost his citizenship. He went back to the country. He reclaimed his Myanmar citizenship, and he's been working for a think tank that does independent work and has also been supporting the reform process under the last two governments. And I can go back regularly now. My other involvement was that I ran a program for civil society organizations for 10 years, training members of civil society organizations in politics and development work so that they could be more effective. And so what's been particularly gratifying since 2012 is many of those people who had to stay in exile for many years are now back in the country, are extremely active, extremely engaged, and going around and seeing them is just probably the most heartwarming thing I've experienced in my life. Yeah?
In terms of what U.S. NGOs or companies are doing work there now?
So a number of NGOs are working in the country. USAID is also supporting a lot of work. One thing that they're working on is agriculture, which I'm really happy about, given how important it is for the country. Smallholder agriculture, microloans, peace process, water. In terms of companies, GE is there. GE is doing electricity, but there's also oil and gas interests there, and other kinds of services, including tech.
Perhaps we might stop there unless there's, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
That's okay.
Please.
So, Constantine introduced you as an anthropologist. Can you speak about how your work or training as an anthropologist intersects with this?
Yeah. So one of the most interesting things for me, as I said in the beginning, that the legacies from the past are difficult to uproot, even though everybody's saying we want change. And one of the things that's interesting is the way that people are raised in Myanmar, because there's such a deficit in the country of trust. People don't trust the government because of their experiences under military rule. People don't trust people of other ethnic groups. People sometimes don't even trust their neighbors. And so the way that people are often raised in Myanmar, and my husband talked about this in his own family, was, you can only trust your family. You can't trust other people. You can be friends with them, but you can't trust them. And so unfortunately, that culture of mistrust has made it more difficult to bring about inclusiveness, bring about peace, bring about resolution to conflict in society. And I would say another thing that really has struck me is the hierarchical nature of society. And so, everybody, when you meet somebody, you're immediately trying to figure out who has seniority and who's the junior person. And then that dictates how you interact with that person. And it's reinforced through religion, because monks are higher than ordinary people. It's reinforced in the education system. There's a real reverence for teachers. If you're a teacher, when you run into that person, you call them teacher for the rest of their life, and you pay respect to them for the rest of their life. You don't challenge them, you don't question them. And so this culture of having to be deferential to people who are your senior also is something that's kind of inhibited progress in many ways, and inhibited kind of deeper conversations sometimes because people feel like they can't speak out.
Let's continue the discussion then over some refreshments. And please join me in thanking